Welcome to this Committee of Budget and Fiscal Review. Our focus today is on the Cap and Trade Program. We're going to hear from the LAO with an overview of AB 32 and the creation of the Cap and Trade Program. We'll hear from a number of departments, including the Department of Finance and a number of agencies. We have, I think, 3 secretaries with us today, and thank them for their presence here in advance of the hearing. And of course, we'll be giving a very close look at the governor's $3 billion cap and trade expenditure plan and the work that we, the legislature, have yet to complete with regard to expenditures in the current year and, of course, then in the budget year. So with all that said, we'll start as a subcommittee and ask Ross Brown from the Legislative Analyst's Office to join us for the initial presentation. Mr. Brown, welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members. Ross Brown with the LAO. I'm going to, in a few minutes, discuss the governor's proposal for the 2016-17 budget, walk through some of those, different pieces of that proposal, as well as our analysis of those different proposals and recommendations based on our recent budget analysis. But before I get into the details of the specific proposal before you in the 16-17 budget, I did want to provide a little bit more of a sort of high-level context and background information regarding AB 32 and the cap and trade program, and try and just sort of set the stage for the role of cap and trade spending as we see it in the context of the state's broader climate change policy goals and the cap and trade program in general. So we did put a handout together for today's hearing, so I hope all the members have that in front of them. If not, then I know the sergeants have copies.
You have it. Yeah, we have it.
Okay. The first few pages of that handout are background information on AB 32, some of the legal requirements on the use of the funds. As you all, I think, are well aware, the requirement that the funds be used on activities that reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Also some background information on page 3 regarding how the funds have been spent so far and the amount of money that has come in. Just for context, our revenue projections are that in the current year, the program will generate about $2.4 billion in revenue, and in the budget year, roughly $2.3 billion in revenue. So I'm happy to answer questions on the background pieces, but I do want to get to page 4 of the handout, which really provides a summary of another recent analysis that we did that looked at sort of more of the policy issues around the cap and trade program and where cap and trade spending fits into the broader program. And really, I think one of the key takeaways from that analysis is trying to get an understanding of how the cap and trade spending side of things interacts with the cap and trade regulation. So we really sort of view the cap and trade program in 2 separate pieces. One, the regulation, which is administered by the Air Resources Board, and the key focus of that regulation is to limit the overall level of emissions from major sources of emissions, including transportation fuels, electricity production, industrial sources. And the mechanism that the Air Resources Board uses to limit overall emissions is issuing a limited number of allowances that allows different businesses and companies to emit different levels of greenhouse gases. And the purpose of the program is, 1, to limit overall level of emissions, and 2, by allowing businesses to buy and sell allowances, it establishes a price on those emissions and provides an incentive for businesses and households to reduce their emissions in the most cost-effective way. And as a result of operating that program and auctioning allowances, the state generates a significant amount of revenue. But in our view, the generation of revenue isn't sort of the primary goal of that program. The primary goal is the regulation and limiting emissions, and as a result of operating the program, it generates revenue for the state. And under the current requirement, as I mentioned, the state must spend that money on greenhouse gas reductions. The sort of next important point I think that we want to make is that requirement to spend that money on greenhouse gas reductions has some interesting and perhaps sort of complicated interactions with the regulation itself. And really the key point is that as long as the cap or the overall number of allowances that is issued by ARB is limiting emissions, that in many cases, by spending money on activities that reduce emissions from those same sources, what that is actually doing is likely just freeing up an allowance that was otherwise being used by one entity, and now they don't have to use it, and it makes it available for another entity to continue to emit. And so in the end, the net effect of spending on activities that reduce emissions from cap sources may simply be to free up allowances and change the sources of emissions, but not the overall level of emissions. So we think that's an important factor and context to keep in mind when thinking about how the legislature should be thinking about spending this money in a way that promotes its priorities in the most effective way. So if you turn to page 5, based on those findings and that analysis, we present some options for the legislature to consider when thinking about cap and trade spending. The first is a scenario under which the legislature removes the current requirement to spend on greenhouse gas emission reductions. It is important to note that to do that would likely require a 2/3 vote of the legislature. But we think by doing that, it would give a lot more flexibility to the legislature to, one, achieve its greenhouse gas goals as long as the cap is still in place, but also use any revenue that comes in from the program to achieve other legislative goals, which could include reducing costs for businesses and households associated with the cap and trade program. And by removing that greenhouse gas reduction requirement, the state would have more flexibility to do such things as provide rebates to households or businesses to help offset their costs, or reduce existing taxes in a way that helps offset some of the higher costs associated with the cap and trade program. So we think there are a lot of benefits associated with taking that approach. The second scenario that we talk about is under the current legal requirement to spend on activities that reduce emissions, and lay out a few strategies that the legislature might want to think about depending on what its priorities are. And the first is, to the extent the priority is to achieve additional net greenhouse gas reductions, then the legislature might want to think about targeting funds to activities that reduce emissions from outside of the cap sector. So sources of emissions that aren't subject to the cap and trade program, such as methane emissions from dairy farms or from landfills, and other types of things and emissions that occur outside of the cap sector and aren't subject to the types of interactions that I just discussed. Another strategy the legislature might want to consider is thinking about targeting, to the extent it's concerned about costs and improving the cost effectiveness of the program, is targeting resources even within the cap sector, but to the most cost effective emission reduction activities. And that type of strategy, we think, sort of should be based on an analysis of where current programs or where current regulations fail to provide adequate incentives for cost-effective reductions, and based on that analysis, then funds could be targeted to help achieve those goals. And then finally, again, if the cap and trade program is in place to help the state meet its greenhouse gas goals and the regulation is in place, then the legislature might want to think about using the revenue and prioritize spending in ways that help achieve some of its other goals, whether it be improvements in regional air quality, whether it be reducing costs for low-income households, whether it be conserving water. And so maybe that's another sort of framework that the legislature might want to think about when thinking about how to prioritize spending amongst all the various programs. So with that, I'm going to turn to page 6 of the handout, which provides information on the 2016-17 governor's proposal and the different programs that are part of the administration's $3.1 billion cap and trade expenditure package. I'm not planning on going through every single proposal. I will walk through just the table and some of the key categories that are in the governor's proposal. Happy to answer any questions that you have, and I know the administration will be up after me to discuss some of their specific proposals. But at a high level of the $3.1 billion, $1.2 billion is part of the continuous appropriations that are in current law that go to several specified programs. Roughly $1 billion would go to additional transportation-related programs. $280 million going to various programs that would increase carbon sequestration. Roughly $200 million going to energy efficiency and renewable energy programs. $195 million going to programs to reduce short-lived climate pollutants, $100 million going to a new local climate program intended to fund local integrated projects that are aimed at reducing emissions in disadvantaged communities, and $90 million for various water efficiency programs. So page 7 provides a summary of our assessment of the governor's 2016-17 proposal. And I think the key takeaway based on our review of the proposal is that the administration doesn't provide a lot of information that really helps the legislature prioritize amongst all of the various programs that are in the administration's expenditure package. And in our view, that's a really key component to you trying to figure out which programs help promote your priorities in the most effective way, and trying to have a better understanding of how funds can be targeted to different programs that help achieve your GHG goals as well as any of your other goals that you're trying to achieve. And in our view, the administration's plan and the analysis that's part of that plan is lacking in two key ways. One is just the broad framework that the administration has established for targeting funds to different categories of programs. In current law, there's a requirement that the administration produce a 3-year investment plan, which is supposed to look at how funds can be targeted in the context of existing programs and existing regulations, and how they can be targeted in a way that achieve the most cost-effective reductions. The administration submitted that plan just a couple weeks ago, and based on our review of the plan, we don't think it provides a whole lot of meaningful information that the legislature can then use to be sure that the different programs that are being prioritized are helping achieve its goals in the most effective way. Essentially, it lays out a lot of different options for programs that could be funded, but there's no real analysis of which of those programs help achieve various goals in the most effective way. And the other type of information that in our view is lacking is just this specifics of some of the different programs, including the projects that will be funded in some of the different programs, as well as details on the estimates of what exact outcomes the legislature can expect by funding some of those different programs, and the methodologies used to develop some of those estimates. If you turn to page 8, we have a summary of, just based on our assessment, recommendations that we have for the legislature. And the first is to direct the administration based on, in our view, what is sort of a lack of information for a lot of the programs and the estimated benefits, direct the administration to provide more robust estimates of the benefits of all of the different programs that they're proposing as part of this budget. As well as an estimate of the degree to which those benefits accrue to disadvantaged communities, and that's an issue that I failed to touch on just a moment ago, but another one of our critiques is that it's not clear from the information that's provided by the administration the degree to which this plan sort of helps meet one of the legislature's priorities of targeting funds to various disadvantaged communities. It's not clear how the overall package, what portion of those benefits are accruing to disadvantaged communities and what types of benefits will ultimately be accruing to disadvantaged communities. And we feel like that's an important piece of information the legislature might want to obtain in order to assess the degree to which this package helps achieve its priorities. Ultimately, the allocation of funds amongst these different priorities is going to come down to a decision by the legislature on sort of how it weighs many of these different priorities, how it weighs greenhouse gas emission reductions compared to other co-benefits such as air quality or reducing costs for low-income households. And there is an inherent level of uncertainty around a lot of these programs, and it's going to be that way, I think, for a little while. And so one thing that the legislature might want to consider is for programs where there's a particular amount of uncertainty, it might want to consider allocating a somewhat smaller level of funding to those programs and waiting until future years to allocate additional funding based on whatever information it collects and whatever the information the administration provides on what has been achieved by those programs. And finally, their final recommendation is to, based on, again, our concerns about the level of analysis that has gone into the administration's plan, is for the legislature to establish a committee that would help develop a more robust investment plan that would help formulate a strategy for targeting funds in a way that's based on an analytical assessment of the degree to which different programs help achieve different greenhouse gas priorities, how they interact with existing programs and existing regulations, as well as potentially develop strategies for estimating the benefits of the programs after they've been implemented. And that way, the legislature perhaps could have more confidence in the programs that are being funded and the information that is being provided about what the benefits of those programs are as it moves forward and makes decisions about funding additional programs in the future. So with that, I will conclude my comments and happy to answer any questions.
Fine presentation. Thank you, Mr. Brown. Colleagues, I'm going to suggest that we take a few moments to ask our questions of Mr. Brown, and then we'll move on to the second panel. We'll hear them out entirely, and then we'll ask questions of them. So early in your presentation, I think you touched on what could be one of the most fundamental concerns of the entire cap-and-trade program, which, of course, was originally conceived to help us reduce our greenhouse gas emissions to be able to meet our long-range state goals. But as you pointed out, if we continue to invest in the 85%, the capped segments, that there's just the opportunity for these allowances to be shifted and that we won't actually get to greenhouse gas reductions, even though we're investing billions of dollars over the coming years. How, if that were to be the case, if that fear were to be realized, how would you or how would we be able to identify it and to definitively reach that conclusion, not just as a conjecture? How will we best be able to document whether we are indeed reducing greenhouse gas emissions by the investments that we are making?
I mean, I think it's a very difficult thing to assess, and I think that's largely a function of the way the cap-and-trade program operates, and that it's market-based, and it provides a lot of flexibility to businesses to sort of buy and sell allowances, and so it makes it very difficult to assess how affecting an emission in one area will then sort of make its way through the rest of the system and how those allowances will free up. I mean, I think it will be important to continue to monitor just the cap-and-trade regulation itself and ensure that that's being implemented in a way that is sort of truly monitoring the emissions that are occurring, and it's being monitored and enforced in a way that is that's actually reducing net emissions. But the question of, how funding will, how sort of from an empirical basis, how you will evaluate the funding proposals and how it makes its way through the rest of the cap-and-trade program is a difficult question, and frankly, one that I'm not sure I have an answer to right now, but one that certainly, we think that our office and the state as a whole should continue to think about strategies for setting up a process to evaluate that.
And you haven't seen any other stakeholder in the program come up with any way to do it any better than what you've not been able to come up with?
No. I mean, but we do think it's an important area to think about, and
really fundamental.
Yes, and continue to look at ways where the legislature can be confident in the programs that it's funding and having a good sense of what actually is being accomplished by funding those various programs. And it's complicated, and we continue to look into it some more, and that's why I think partly why we made some recommendations to perhaps establish a committee of experts that will help the administration and us sort of think through ways to do that and ways to target funds.
Mr. Brown, we're going to break just for a moment to establish our quorum. If you could call the roll, please. Here.
Nielsen?
Here.
Allen? Anderson?
Here.
Bell? Locke? Hancock? Mitchell? Monning? Morlock? Nguyen? Pan? Pabley? Roth. Stone. Wolk. We have a quorum.
All right, we have our quorum. In previous presentations to the committee, Mr. Taylor has always urged caution when we engage in continuous appropriations, in that the legislature loses any ability for real scrutiny and oversight. I think there was some wisdom in our going forward. I don't know that any of us are looking to revisit that concept for purposes of making sure that monies are expended for purposes they were intended, as well as relieving at least a portion of this large pot of money from the annual challenges of so many interests vying for some piece of the revenues. So we have this continuous appropriation. What might you suggest we put into statute that would allow for the continuous appropriation, and at the same time, and I don't think this is oxymoronic, that would still allow us to have some review on a regular basis? And if we, in our reviews, saw that things were going off course, we of course could revisit that portion of the continuous appropriation. Any ideas on that?
And I think in general, regardless of whether or not the money is being appropriated through a continuous appropriation or through the annual budget process, it's still an important part of the program to continue to evaluate the degree to which different programs are achieving the expected outcome, the outcomes that were expected when they were first given funding. And so I think from our view, the key is on the evaluation side of things, and the administration may discuss, there's an annual March report that's currently in statute that is supposed to provide the legislature with information on the outcomes that have been achieved so far with the funding that has gone out so far. And we think, as part of that process, the evaluation should be for the continuously appropriated programs as well as the non-continuously appropriated programs, because you will want to sort of, regardless of sort of how the money is appropriated, you want to sort of continue to ensure that that money is going to the most effective programs.
What is your assessment of our oversight structure with regard to the continuous appropriation at this point?
I think
with regard to reporting and assessment.
I think we're still in some ways, still in the early stages of getting a sense of how that reporting structure is going to play out. Again, there's the report in March that is forthcoming that I think is the primary tool that's in statute to provide that oversight and try and get an understanding of how programs are operating and working so far. The first report, or the report last year, provided some initial information, but for the most part, a lot of the programs were still getting off the ground, and so there wasn't a lot of detailed information available. This year, we expect that there will be some more additional detailed information available. But in the end, the usefulness of that report, I think, will depend on the quality of the analysis that goes behind that report and the quality of analysis that goes into those numbers and those estimates that are provided to you. And so that's where we think a lot of the focus should be, is in ensuring that those reports and those analyses and the information that you're provided is based on sound analytical analysis and sound estimates.
We have sliced and diced all of these different programs into different categories, whether we're talking about transportation or energy production, industry. Have we had any sense of what percentage of our current greenhouse gas emissions are coming from small and medium-sized businesses? Or is there a way to determine that?
There might be. I mean, that might be an issue that I would have to follow up with on ARB. I mean, I think, the cap and trade program covers roughly 85% of the state's emissions, and that's largely coming from major emitters like power plants and industrial sources, but also includes transportation fuel, which the compliance obligation is on the transportation fuel providers, but the actual emissions are coming from, the cars and the gasoline that's being burned from those cars. And so I don't know that I have sort of a breakdown of the proportion of emissions that come from small versus medium businesses.
Something we could determine?
Possibly, I would have to follow up with them.
The reason I ask is that I think to the degree that we are able to make use of these dollars to reach the goal as intended, reducing greenhouse gas emissions, that much of this has been top-down and looking at the major industries, major emitters, major energy producers. But we've really got a grassroots establishment of business that very much would like to participate, but may not know how to do so, may not know how to access some capital to be able to do so, so that they have more sustainable businesses. And to the degree that we really could spread that out, I would think that there's a lot of opportunity for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. In fact, it really potentially would be a change in the way we do business entirely. But I think it would be important for us to be able to benchmark initially what percentage of greenhouse gas emissions, just as we've benchmarked in other areas, so that we could then recognize what percentage of the challenge business represents. And again, I'm talking about more small and medium as opposed to the very large corporate entities, and then look at ways to engage them in becoming more sustainable themselves.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, an important part of the program and thinking about spending is thinking about ways in which sort of the current programs and the current incentives perhaps don't provide those incentives to certain types of households or certain types of businesses to sort of reduce their emissions in the most cost-effective way, and looking at ways in which the spending can be targeted to sort of help achieve those various goals.
Okay. Thank you very much. Colleagues, we're going to try and get to everybody. Senator Nielsen has a few questions, and then Senator Pavley, and Senator Wolk, and Senator Morlock.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
And Senator Roth, and Senator Block, and Senator Pan.
No block.
No Block.
This is a tremendous amount of money. The most telling indication of that is the amount of groups and individuals who descend on this legislature coveting that money when we have our hearings. And it alarms me, the continuous appropriation. I'd like to envision some kind of a disciplinary mechanism to the continuous appropriation, whereby the legislature could suspend that continuous appropriation for cause. It just cannot be a blank check on and on and on. Why it cannot be? Because there are no answers. Nobody knows. There are no protocols. There's no scientific basis and evidence of anything that's going on with this whole scenario with cap and trade. All the questions, well, we really don't know. There are no standards. There's no evidence. And I just don't understand how we can proceed and how we can just give a blank check. Yes, it'll be a continuous appropriation. That's just too risky. There's too little certainty. We, the legislature, are obliged to the people that we represent to be the conscience and the guide. So I'm looking for some guidance, and I don't have the answer myself, and I don't hear it from you. But I'm not willing to offer and advocate a blank check of a continuous appropriation for this amount of money to an administration. Just go spend it. That's terrifying to me when we do not know. There's too many vicissitudes out here and too little certainty. It appears, too, that where the administration wants to go is leapfrogging way beyond AB 32. That was rejected last year in the legislature, and isn't this now a jump beyond where AB 32 required in terms of the goals?
I mean, a lot of the programs that are part of the administration's proposal, I think, have more long-term greenhouse, at least part of the goal and the purpose of some of those programs is more long-term greenhouse gas emission reductions. Yeah, so I mean, I think it's a fair question of to what extent are those goals part of the legislature's direction and part of the legislature's goals, and how to think about sort of spending to achieve the AB 32 goals versus any other goals that the legislature has.
Well, again, that's ceding the authority of the people through their elected representatives to administration, and again, without any confidence that it's going to be beneficial. That is very, very much of concern to me, and I appreciate you bringing that to our attention. Another quick point, and then I'll see till later questions. What will the impact of this cap and trade on gasoline prices for the motorists? Do we have any way of determining at the pump what's it costing the motoring public?
We're not able to tell the exact amount. There are ways to try and estimate based on what the current allowance prices are, what that impact on gasoline would be, and just based on some of the information that we have and that we've looked at current allowance prices, if all of those costs are then passed along to, in the form of higher gasoline prices, it's roughly 10 cents a gallon or so.
Okay, so there is some impact of all of this.
Yeah. I mean, you have to make some assumptions about how the costs make their way on to consumers, but based on some research that's out there about the degree to which those costs are passed along, then yes, it's reasonable to assume that consumers are paying some higher gas prices.
Last question for now. Is the market functioning well, do you think?
The cap and trade market?
Yes, cap and trade.
Yeah. I mean, there haven't been any, at least that we're aware of, any sort of major concerns, but I think it's also important to point out that, again, we're in still somewhat the early stages of particularly the big change associated with bringing transportation fuels under the cap, which occurred last year. And the cap is just beginning to be sort of ratcheted down. The number of allowances that are being issued is beginning to go down. And that's really sort of the key mechanism that helps sort of drive the reductions in emissions. And so I think there's still a lot to be learned about once that becomes more stringent and once the requirements become more stringent, how exactly that's going to play out and how well the program is going to be sort of monitored and working so far.
Would the majority of the burden be on the motoring public through gasoline, the cap and trade program? Would that be the bigger burden?
As far as the burden associated with auctioning the allowances, then most of that is coming through the fact that transportation fuels are added and the allowances associated with those fuels are not given away and that they're auctioned off. And so when it comes to the revenue that's coming into the state, the large majority of that is the result of bringing transportation fuels under the cap and auctioning the allowances.
Thank you.